the apocalypse. When an entire people are destroyed or destroy themselves. The end of civilization. For us today, as we go about our daily lives, it's barely something we consider. We're so sure it couldn't happen to us. But for some civilizations, it already has. El Dorado, the lost city of gold. In the 17th century, explorers from the Spanish Empire search for the lost city deep in South America. In Peru, among harsh desert conditions, they find dozens of strange pyramids, many with gold buried deep within. Is this the real lost city of gold? These pyramids belong to a mysterious civilization we call the Moche. From the 1st century CE, and for hundreds of years, the Moche flourish along the north coast of Peru.
The Moche are one of the most exciting and interesting ancient civilizations, rivaling what we see in Egypt.
Living to the north of the Nazca civilization, who left behind them mysterious forms carved into the landscape. The Moche people build some of the largest structures ever seen in the Americas. Their art reveals a culture of high sophistication, depicting a society that indulges in brutal, bloodletting human sacrifice. The Moche dominate northern Peru for centuries, until around the year 650 CE, when they seem to disappear from history.
What happened to the Moche is sort of a mystery.
Now, new science and forensic investigations are revealing new answers to the question, what ancient apocalypse destroys the Moche and their cities of gold? The lust for gold spans human history. To possess it seems to ignite an insatiable desire for more. For centuries, this obsession gives rise to the legend of an entire city of gold. And in the 16th and 17th centuries, the legend is commonly known by its Spanish name of El Dorado, the Golden One.
This was the idea that somewhere in the dark, exotic lands of South America, there was a city of gold ruled by a godlike king.
When Spanish explorer Francisco Pizarro González reaches South America in the early 16th century, he begins looking for a place of great wealth throughout what we now call Peru. There, he encounters the Inca civilization and conquers it. But Pizarro has no idea that with the Incas, he is encountering the culmination of a chain of civilizations that have shaped South America for more than a millennium. He is not interested in research. He is only interested in gold. And along the northern coast of Peru, in the Moche River Valley, he finds something mysterious. Here is a giant ancient structure that locals say once belonged not to the Incas, but to a forgotten ancient civilization. They call it the Huaca del Sol, the Shrine of the Sun.
When the Spanish come across the Huaca del Sol, they see this enormous pyramid. Would have been almost 50 meters tall.
The Spanish conquistadors looked for a quick method to get at the treasures they hoped lay inside.
They diverted the Moche River to look for gold inside the Huaca del Sol.
That river took 2/3 of that structure and just washed it away.
It's likely that what the Spanish saw was very, very elaborate burials or temple areas that were decorated with gold, had golden ornaments or golden artifacts in them that they took.
The gold was never to be seen again, probably melted down and lost forever.
The truth is, the Spanish conquistadors just didn't really know what they'd discovered.
Today, scattered around the region are dozens more of these strange mounds in the landscape, easily mistaken for giant mud hills. But take a closer look, and you'll see bricks made out of mud. These aren't hills at all. They're all ancient pyramids. And their rediscovery creates a mystery. What happened to the civilization who built them? Peru, 1899. Pioneering German archaeologist Max Uhle is exploring South America.
Max Uhle was a German archaeologist who did a lot of work in Peru, in different parts of Peru.
He was the first professional archaeologist. His standards were quite advanced because he did take notes and he understood the importance of photography, which was something that was still relatively new.
Arriving in the Moche Valley, Uhle sees the area that Pizarro ransacked hundreds of years before. He decides to dig into another pyramid-shaped structure, known locally as Huaca de la Luna, the Shrine of the Moon. During excavations, Uhle finds a beautiful golden image of a face, edged in copper. A face looking at him across 1,000 years of history. What is the date of this mysterious culture? Uhle is determined to find out.
The main technique that he pioneered was to look at changing ceramic styles as an indicator of changes in time.
He was the first one to use this kind of scientific understanding of these ceramics come before these ceramics that come before these ceramics.
Based on this new method, Uhle provisionally dates the end of this mysterious civilization to sometime around 600 CE. His dig marks the beginning of a vast number of finds at this lost city. Epic painted murals depicting strange gods, finely painted ceramics, and a platform, along with bone fragments that he believes is used for human sacrifices. Here is something incredible, a previously unknown and unnamed civilization. Who are they, and what was their fate? As Uhle progresses his digs, the true scale of how this ancient city might have looked begins to reveal itself. Situated at the foot of a white mountain, the Cerro Blanco, in the east of the city is the Huaca de la Luna, made up of plazas, ceremonial squares, and large terraces, all connected with ramps. Across the city is the Huaca del Sol. It stands 50 meters high and 340 meters by 160 meters at its base. And between these two imposing structures is an urban sprawl of great avenues, houses, and squares, capable of housing a population of 25,000 people. But while Uhle has uncovered the buildings of this civilization, he also wants to investigate other cultures across South America. So he stops his work on the Moche in order to uncover other archaeological sites, leaving behind him a great mystery. Why is this ancient society of the Moche lost to history? To answer that, a local man will devote his life to telling the world about these lost people, and he will give them a name. Moche Valley, Peru. In the 1930s, Rafael Laco Hoyle is one of the first to systematically investigate the ancient culture of this region, and is inspired by Max Euler's work decades before.
He's the one who really took what Ule did and built on that in terms of chronology.
Though not formally trained in archaeology, Laco collects over 40,000 pottery vessels. And he finally names this civilization after the river valley in which they are found, the Moche.
He described the Moche culture, he defined the Moche culture.
The Moche are one of the most exciting and interesting ancient civilizations in all of South America. They're known for their huge, monumental architecture, adobe temples, and incredible murals that decorate these temples, as well as really specific ceramic styles and metallurgy and amazing crafts.
But perhaps the most important aspect of the Moche's survival is a vast network of irrigation canals that channel water from the mountains to the valleys, where they cultivate corn, beans, peanuts, fruit, and cotton. But how big is this Moche civilization? Laco believes that the Moche culture spreads over 400 kilometers of territory. It is a confederation of small states spread along the coast. Each state is ruled by their own governments, or elite. But Laco believes they are all united by a common culture, language, and religion. Administered from a central state power in the city of Huacas de Moche.
So he saw the Moche as a uniform culture, a state system that ran basically with the common political system, religious system, racial system. You know, it was all part of a piece.
But when investigating the fate of the Moche, there's a problem. Unlike ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, Maya glyphs, or Akkadian cuneiform, the Moche leave no trace of a written language.
There's some challenges to studying Moche because there was no writing system. So everything that we know as archaeologists comes from digging in the dirt.
The Moche do, however, leave behind intricate murals portraying different scenes that Laco believes give clues to the Moche way of life. And painted pottery resembling ancient Greek in their style.
These contain these really epic scenes of probably a mix between mythical life and real life that are painted around a vessel.
But they also show images of strange demonic animals and the ritual consumption of sacrificial victims' blood.
The Moche, we know, performed human sacrifice. I mean, we see it in their artwork on the pots and the designs.
Laco believes the Moche elite offer human sacrifices to try and secure agricultural fertility, keeping them in power and their social structure intact. But despite collecting thousands of artifacts, Laco is unable to answer the question, why do the Moche disappear from history? The Moche Valley, Peru, 2022. This is one of the harshest living environments on the planet. It's a brutal, arid, desert-like region in between the Andes and the Pacific coast. Archaeologist Carlos Rengifo believes the answer to studying the demise of the Moche civilization lies in the landscape.
The Moche transformed their environment. They created the landscape that allowed the development of societies here.
Archaeology reveals that many of the constructions seen here were in fact originally built by the Moche. Irrigation canals. Incredibly, the Moche's canals are still in use today.
The fact that we have cities today prospering here is a sort of a miracle of our ancient population.
The Moche undertook hydraulic engineering on a massive scale.
The sheer extension of their hydraulic systems in the Moche world is just breathtaking. More than 1,200 kilometers of networks of canals.
The valleys of the Moche territory were transformed by this massive terraforming project. Rivers and canals and irrigation ditches were dug extending right across the land, reaching every corner of the Moche civilization.
These canals did require sophisticated engineering knowledge, sophisticated knowledge of the landscape. So in terms of the engineering sophistication, the Moche are on par with ancient Rome.
But Carlos believes that the vast irrigation network was more than just a supply of water. It was also a major factor in the development of the Moche civilization itself.
The canals were sort of like the unifying force that these communities needed in order to prosper.
Mastering the stuff of life, water, the Moche were able to sustain a sophisticated civilization for hundreds of years. But there's a problem. Irrigation-led farming is particularly vulnerable to one unpredictable natural disaster. Earthquakes. Simply put, tectonic shifts move the earth and change the flow of water, damaging the soil, and even create more arid land.
There is a process whereby earthquakes will shake loose soil in these desert valleys. The soil will be washed down to the ocean, and the sand blows back into the lower valleys as sand dunes.
The damage to an agricultural landscape can be devastating. Was the Moche civilization vulnerable to earthquakes? And might this hold the key to the disappearance of the Moche?
The coast of Peru is a seismically active zone. You have two plates meeting each other, the South American plate and the Nazca plate.
Deep underground, the Nazca plate is constantly being forced beneath the South American plate. It causes friction until eventually it breaks.
And this tectonic action creates lots of earthquakes, which makes living in Peru difficult and unstable.
It is possible that a series of dramatic and devastating earthquakes contributed to the end of the Moche.
So how badly were the Moche stricken by seismic shocks? Carlos thinks there are clues hidden in the epic architecture of the city, and in particular its huge, dominant temple, the Huaca del Sol.
Huaca del Sol can be said to be one of the masterpieces of Moche architecture.
made up of over 140 million bricks. It once stood up to 50 meters tall.
Depending on the magnitude of the earthquake, the tremors can really impact on built structures. At higher magnitudes of 6 and above, buildings begin to shake and they can actually fall apart.
So, is there evidence of earthquake damage here? When archaeologists focus their work on the construction of the temple, they notice something unusual in the foundations: large mud bricks.
Between these large mud bricks, there's a space. We call them slip joints.
Slip joints are an ingenious construction technique.
They are separated from one another for about 4 to 6 centimeters, and that gap is filled out with sand. So in case of an earthquake or seismic shock, the structure did not fracture, but only slightly and gently move, and then after the wave, came back to their original place.
Their discovery suggests the Moche understood the threat of earthquakes and even factored them into their buildings.
They were very forward-thinking people, they were clever, and they were good engineers.
It appears that although a big earthquake would have disrupted Moche life, they had built up a resilience to the tremors. And the surviving canals today suggest that their irrigation network was just as resilient. For historians, there's no way of knowing if a big earthquake ever hit the Moche. The records don't go back that far. So if seismic shocks aren't what finished life off for the Moche, then what did? Carlos and a team of archaeologists investigate further.
What happened to the Moche is sort of a mystery.
They scan the city using GPR, or ground-penetrating radar. They map the city from above and make new excavations. At its peak, around the middle of the 7th century, the city is one of the largest in the Americas, with huge temples and a vast urban area covering around 60 hectares.
So all of that is what made of this place one of the greatest cities of its time.
Carlos believes that the clues to this great city's mysterious demise are hidden here, waiting to be uncovered. And it's at this temple, the Huaca de la Luna, that there is one mystery in particular to be solved: human sacrifice.
This is the sacrificial area of Huaca de la Luna. If you were walking around here, it meant that you were preparing and performing human sacrifices.
In 1995, something unexpected is dug up.
The team of archaeologists led by Steve Bourget are excavating at the Huaca de la Luna, but they had no idea what they would find next.
He unearthed an amazing find, which was the bodies of sacrificed individuals. How do we know they were sacrificed? Well, it is very obvious. You can see how many times that their throat was slit by the scars on the neck. They've had their arms and legs pulled off and separated.
And not just a few skeletons, but many.
Those archaeological works revealed the body remains of about 60 people spread around the whole plaza.
And then, something else macabre. Some of the victims have had their heads cut off.
We suspect that decapitation was involved in some specific rituals.
This is a shocking discovery. Evidence of a mass ritual of human sacrifice. Further analysis reveals something else: a date.
This sacrificial event seems to have occurred around 600 AD.
The year 600. That's right around the time the Moche civilization mysteriously collapsed. Are these sacrificial victims a clue to the ancient apocalypse of the Moche? To find answers, archaeologists look deeper into one important clue: the art of the Moche. Hundreds of scenes that were painted onto pottery have been recorded in what archaeologists call rollout drawings.
They are spectacular drawings of the paintings on these Moche vessels.
And there's one scene in particular of great interest to the investigators: the sacrifice ceremony.
The sacrifice ceremony is found on a number of pottery vessels made in similar style.
Sacrificial victims are seen having their throats cut, and a cup or chalice is presented to a powerful figure.
That chalice has been interpreted to contain the blood of sacrifice victims.
Is this what happened in the mass sacrifice at the Huaca de la Luna?
We started to realize that the scenes, these pictures of these people, it was matching up to the archaeology. And so it kind of became like, oh wow, maybe these scenes that are on these rollout drawings are actually telling us something about life.
Carlos examines the murals of the walls of the city, and suddenly they make more sense too. Here are clear images of captives from some kind of violent conflict, apparently being led to their fate as sacrificial victims.
One group is the defeated warriors, that they are now prisoners, and now they're being paraded here, dragged with a rope tied that is tied on their neck. And then there's the second group of warriors. They are the winners.
Whether this is a result of foreign invasion or civil war is unclear. What is clear is that the defeated are sometimes sacrificed in great numbers. The question is the very social stability of the Moche civilization linked to this mass human sacrifice? To investigate further, experts look to other Moche sites for clues. 45 kilometers north of the Huacas de Moche is another city of the Moche civilization, El Brujo. A huge man-made pyramid remains. And just like its city neighbor, the Huacas de Moche, it too has images of captives being led to sacrifice. In 2006, an incredible discovery is made.
I was digging at this wonderful site. It's called the El Brujo Archaeological Complex.
One of Jeff's colleagues is using GPR at a part of the site called the Cao Viejo Temple when he sees something unusual.
He came back and said, whoa, I found a cavity. It wasn't solid because these huacas are built of solid bricks. And so if you find a cavity through the GPR, it means there's something down there.
After digging, what they discover is completely unexpected. A Moche mummy and grave goods of the finest quality, gold and jewelry. This is clearly the grave of an important Moche figure and probably a ruler of the region. But who is this mummy? To find out, they have to unwrap it.
Man, the unwrapping of that mummy was just something else. And so I got to actually check in every day and watch them take another layer, take another layer.
Eventually, Inside, they find the remains of a tattooed woman. She is named the Lady of Kao, after the temple in which she is found.
Yeah, that was an incredibly exciting discovery.
The unveiling of a high-status woman changes perceptions of the Moche as a male-dominated society. And her discovery joins the ranks of other bodies of the ruling elite, like the Lord of Sipan, found at the Sipan Moche site in 1987. But both these high-status burials have something strange alongside them. Carefully prepared sacrificial victims. Why? Carbon dating of the bones suggests the burial of the Lady of Kao dates from the years before the end of the 5th century. That's over a century before the mass sacrifices at the Huaca de la Luna and the estimated collapse of the Moche. It suggests to experts that the carefully prepared sacrifices found in the high-status burials were part of a controlled ritual in a stable social structure. The mass killings discovered at the Huacas de Moche is a very different scene. So what happened to the Moche around 600 CE to so radically change their sacrificial practices? Then, the archaeologists make a new discovery. Closer analysis of the victims show that they appear to be buried in extremely unusual circumstances. Unlike other sacrifice victims discovered at other sites, which are found covered in sand, many of these skeletons are compacted in mud. A mud derived from the adobe bricks that are used to make the Moche pyramids. And this could only happen in extremely wet conditions. The mystery is, how is this possible?
One theory as to why the bodies were found encased in mud is that this happened at a time of flooding.
And these people are perhaps being murdered in the pouring rain, perhaps in the middle of a terrifying storm, a serious rainstorm where it feels like it's the end of days. You have to start to paint a picture of something that must have looked apocalyptic.
The bones of the victims are examined in forensic analysis.
You have to ask, is the fact of this extraordinary weather event and the fact of this extraordinary episode of violence, are they linked?
It's a mystery. But for anyone who knows Peru, the first thought of wet, heavy rains means only one thing: an El Niño. Today, an El Niño happens around once every 7 years, and the Moche are right in the danger zone.
When the El Niño strikes, the weather patterns over the equatorial Pacific Ocean are kind of tipped over on its head. Under normal conditions, winds blowing across this part of the ocean move warm water from the east to the west. During an El Niño, this process of the winds blowing across the equatorial Pacific Ocean actually slow down, or in even some cases, switch off.
It results in torrential rains that flood the land, destroying houses and crops, and often taking lives. So for the Moche, did an El Niño event create social instability, evidenced in the mass human sacrifices? Archaeologist Ari Karamanika investigates the climate of the ancient Moche region. She is looking at the evidence hidden in the surviving ancient irrigation channels.
We'll take samples of soil or of sediment from an ancient archaeological field, and then we can begin to reconstruct what kind of agro-ecosystem was developed in the sort of co-evolution of Moche irrigation infrastructure and this desert environment.
Ari knows that the Moche's canal network is vast, spreading for hundreds of kilometers right across the Moche territory. And what she finds is unexpected.
When an El Niño results in flow down some of these typically dry ravines, the Moche were prepared for that, and they were prepared to capture that water, divert it, slow down the velocity of that water so it wouldn't destroy carefully prepared fields.
It seems the Moche factored in an El Niño event into their farming practices.
So the Moche did anticipate these El Niño events.
So if the Moche had learned to live with an El Niño, is a different weather event the cause of their collapse? Professor Lonnie Thompson studies ice. At Ohio State University, he collects ice core samples taken from the Peruvian Andes.
Glaciers and ice cores are probably one of our best archives of our past because they record not only the climate history, things like temperature, but also we can reconstruct the history of precipitation. There are very few archives that can do that.
In 1995, around the time that the mass sacrifices are discovered, Thompson finds something intriguing in the ice. The Andes region suffers severe weather changes from the end of the 6th century and into the 7th. Thompson's discovery suggests that what hits the Moche is no ordinary El Niño. This is something huge, a mega El Niño.
An El Niño event usually wreaks havoc and devastation on communities, but a mega El Niño event can be quite apocalyptic in nature.
And the dates fit the archaeology.
It seems that there is a strong relation between the sacrificial event that occurred in this plaza and the whole context of the events of El Niño phenomenon of 600 AD.
And the ice core evidence reveals something else. Immediately following the rains and the floods is a weather event guaranteed to bring death to the Moche Valley. A devastating drought, one that may have lasted up to 30 years.
There were droughts, so there's no doubt that it would have impacted production.
And it appears that after the time of the mass sacrifices in 600 CE, many Moche sites are later found covered in tons of sand, as if precious artifacts, homes, and whole temples are left abandoned to the desert. Finally, is this the answer to what killed off the Moche?
The Moche people living through this mega El Niño event of catastrophic flooding, followed by catastrophic drought, it would have shaken their faith. All the things that you took for granted before, that you would make offerings to the gods, that you would pay due reverence to the priests and to the elites who lead you, it will force you to stop and go, hang on a minute. You're the ones making sacrifices so that I can live well. If the gods are angry, maybe it's not my fault, maybe it's your fault, maybe you're wrong, and it forces changes into the system.
The extreme weather events would have shaken Moche society to its core. And perhaps This is the explanation for the mass sacrifice at Huaca de la Luna. That after catastrophic flooding and decades of mega drought, Moche civilization descends into chaos. With desperate sacrifices to the gods for salvation, a salvation that never comes. For decades, this theory dominates the view of how the Moche civilization collapsed, until a new generation of archaeologists begin to make some startling discoveries. Discoveries that throw everything that is known about the Moche into doubt. In 2001, American anthropologist Tom Dillahay continues the investigation into the Moche story.
I would describe the Moche culture and society as the first great civilization on the north coast of Peru. But what did it leave behind?
He studies their ceramics and re-examines the timeline of the Moche. New ceramic finds suggest to Dillahay that the Moche live on until around 850, before finally disappearing from history. But can this really be the case? To confirm his theory, Dillahay takes a new perspective, instead looking away from the main sites of Moche culture.
I study the long-term dimension of development on the north coast of Peru. So when we talk about collapse, demise, abandonment, disappearance, I think it mainly relates to the big pyramids and the big sites. But the population goes on existing.
So what happens to the Moche population to make it ultimately disappear? Dillahay and a team decide to survey some little-known sites in a valley known as Hecatepeca to see if they can shed light on the mystery. One of these sites is called Cerro Chapén. The artifacts here show characteristic traits of the Moche. And carbon dating suggests that the site begins around 600 and ends around 850 CE.
It's foot survey, but we use satellite imagery and LiDAR as well to map sites.
The maps of the site show walls, floor plans, and street patterns that can't be seen from the ground. Cerro Chapén is surrounded by an enormous wall, something not previously seen in Moche cities. What could this mean?
We've recorded several defensive positions. Some of these are hilltop fortresses.
It's a shocking discovery. Hilltop fortresses and defensive walls means only one thing: the threat of conflict.
I suspect a significant percentage of it was probably true warfare, physical violence.
The evidence is unequivocal. The Moche had been at war. The critical question is, with who? The most obvious assumption is that a weakened Moche had been invaded by a neighboring people. One possibility is a civilization that has developed to the south of the Moche, a people called the Wari.
The Wari, being the big empire to the south of the Moche, really starts to kind of pick up around 600.
But at the time of the construction of these defenses, around the year 700, there's no evidence that suggests any kind of invasion from the Wari. So if there was no Wari invasion at this point, why the commitment to defense? There seems to be only one other possibility. Ritual violence gives way to civil war. A civil war that appears to rip the world of the Moche in two. The early archaeologists Max Uller and Rafael Larco understood the Moche to be a grand, singular civilization, organized around a centralized state based at the capital city of Huacas de Moche. But what if that assumption is wrong? Based on the new archaeology, after around 650, the Moche culture appears to split into a northern regime and a southern one. The Huacas de Moche is no longer the seat of all power, and each regime vies for its most precious resource: water.
There were probably moments of intense conflict up and down the coast. And if you don't have a centralized political authority overseeing that, there's potential conflict there.
So do the Moche manage to survive earthquakes, mega floods, and extreme droughts, only for them to be ripped apart by internal fighting over water? Here was a new theory for the demise of the Moche. But was civil war, fueled by the fight for water, enough to wipe out the entire Moche people for good? Then, new archaeological finds suggest there might be one final nail in the coffin of the Moche. From around the 800s, a new architectural style emerges across the Moche territory. The mud bricks of the Moche pyramids are replaced by stone walls. The art and design change from fine line painted vases to a more geometric style. And there are new methods of constructing water channels that are built. All these are clues to a radical new way of thinking about the end of the Moche.
What it's showing is that there was a transition.
The question is, a transition influenced by who? To answer that, we have to look to another civilization who are developing in another part of what is modern-day Peru. Situated to the south of the Moche is the emerging civilization of the Wari. Driven by the desire to expand, they move north into Moche territory in military campaigns and incursions, forcing some of the Moche north and assimilating others into their fold.
The Moche people start to take on Wari culture, and ultimately, the Moche are assimilated into disappearance.
After 850, no further archaeological evidence of the Moche has been found. This once great civilization that stretched across modern Peru is overrun by a new culture, the Wari. For hundreds of years, and 500 years before the Incas, the Moche culture thrives in one of the harshest climates on Earth. But weakened by a mega El Niño and droughts, many settlements are abandoned, and the survivors are ripped apart by internal strife. And when a new culture blossoms in the south, the Moche have nothing to offer and are absorbed into the society of their successors.
The Moche culture just kind of fades away in the sunset.
An entire civilization, the Moche, that builds some of the largest structures in prehistoric America, is finally lost to history.